Did you hear the news this morning? A young African president just stood before the world, locked eyes with Trump, and said what the world has been too afraid to say for far too long. This wasn't gossip. It wasn't a leak. It was real, and it just shook global politics to its core. Not everyone has the guts to do that, but Ibraim Trrowé did, president of Burkina Vaso, barely past 30, dressed in his military uniform, calm and unshaken, among a sea of designer suits, a man from a country the media rarely mentions yet. Today all eyes were on him. It happened at the Global Leadership Summit in Geneva, a gathering of the most powerful people on Earth. Presidents, prime ministers, billionaires, and tech titans sat shoulder to shoulder beneath chandeliers that cost more than most villages. They came to talk about peace growth and the future of humanity, at least on paper. But no one expected something real to happen. Traoré didn't show up to network. He showed up to make the room hold its breath. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear might just make history, just minutes after the summit began. The stage lights dimmed and the first major speaker stepped forward. It was Trump, known globally for his brash tone, unpredictable statements, and unapologetic opinions, wearing his trademark suit and confident grin. He looked around the grand hall filled with world leaders, paused for dramatic effect, and dropped a line that would send shockwaves far beyond those walls. "When you look at Africa," he said casually, "you just see chaos and corruption. You don't know who's running what. Honestly, it's a mess. Total disaster." A few awkward chuckles rippled through the room. Some leaders shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to laugh, object, or pretend they hadn't heard it. A few nodded, perhaps out of habit or fear of drawing attention. Cameras, blinked eyes darted the marble floors, and golden chandeliers suddenly felt colder, heavier. But in the far side of the room, Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't smirk. He didn't look around to see who was watching. Instead, he stood slowly, calmly, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The shuffle of his boots on the polished floor was almost too loud. In the stunned silence, a few heads turned, then more security stiffened slightly. Journalists reached for their pens. One by one, eyes began to track him as he made his way toward the center aisle. Not rushing, not hesitating. Each step had weight. Each step said enough when he reached the front. He stopped just short of the podium. He didn't grab the microphone. He didn't adjust his collar. He simply looked at Trump, held his gaze, and said, "With all due respect, Mr. Trump, you have no idea what Africa truly is." The room froze. You could almost hear. Hearts skip, heads turned so fast it was audible. Some gasped quietly. Others instinctively reached for their phones. The media booth lit up in red record lights. Traoré wasn't yelling. He wasn't even angry. But in that one sentence, he'd cracked open a silence that had lasted for decades. His uniform stood out stark against the backdrop of tuxedos and navy suits. The flag of Burkina Vaso on his chest gleamed under the lights. His posture was firm, unshaken, as though the weight of generations had settled on his shoulders. But instead of buckling, he stood taller. All cameras pointed at him. Now all whispers had stopped. What began as another diplomatic gathering had shifted. The air was no longer heavy with protocol. It was charged with truth, with tension, with something that felt alive. Then Traoré took one small step forward, not toward Trump, but toward the center of the room. The space opened before him like a stage, and with every eye locked on his presence, he began to speak, not in anger, not with fire, but with clarity so sharp it cut deeper than any shout could. Africa is not chaos. Africa is not corruption. Africa is history. Africa is resilience. The room stayed silent, but it wasn't the silence of discomfort anymore. It was the kind that comes when people realize they're witnessing something they can't look away from. Traoré didn't glance at his notes. He had none. His voice was steady, his words precise, like he wasn't speaking to the room, but through it, to something older, bigger. When your ancestors arrived on our soil, they didn't find chaos. They found civilizations, gold, wisdom, kingdoms that traded, healed, taught, and lived in balance. What came after was not partnership, it was plunder. He paused. You drew borders with no regard for language, tribe, or history. You enslaved generations. And when we finally won our independence, we inherited systems that were never designed to serve us. They were built to fail. A flicker of discomfort crossed some faces. Others leaned forward. The truth was raw. It scraped off the diplomatic polish and exposed the scaffolding of hypocrisy underneath. Yes, we have problems, Traoré continued. But let me ask you why. Because your phones run on our minerals. Your desserts are sweetened by our cocoa. Your cars and factories are fueled by our oil. He paused again, letting the contrast hang in the air like smoke. And in return, our children eat once a day. If they're lucky, our youth walk streets with degrees in hand and no jobs to go to our hospitals. Lack medicine while our resources fill your vaults. A few leaders looked down, others exchanged uneasy glances. No one interrupted. No one dared. You call us corrupt, he said slowly. But what do you call the Western companies who pay bribes to steal what's ours? What do you call the tax havens where African billions disappear? The banks that welcome the wealth of our dictators? The silence when wars erupt over contracts signed in your boardrooms? Now, even the journalists seasoned detached were scribbling. Faster Trrowé hadn't raised his voice once, but the walls seemed to echo with the weight of everything unsaid. For decades, he wasn't there to accuse. Blindly, he was holding up a mirror, one the world had tried not to look into, and still he spoke without bitterness. Just truth. Truth that didn't ask for sympathy. It demanded reckoning, and outside those walls in cities and villages across Africa, millions would soon hear these words and realize they'd just been spoken, not behind closed doors, but in the heart of power itself. Trrowé let the silence settle for just a moment longer, long enough for the truth he'd spoken to echo in the bones of every person in the room. Then, with a softer voice and a steady breath, he said, "Let me tell you a story, a real one." His tone shifted, not to plead, not to dramatize, but to bring something personal into a room where policy too often forgets people. There's a boy in a small village in Burkina Vaso. His name is Malik. He's 12 years old. The name alone carried weight. He wasn't a statistic. He wasn't a headline. He was someone's child every morning. Before the sun rises, Malik wakes up. He doesn't get ready for school. He grabs a plastic container and walks 6 miles barefoot. Not to explore, not to play, to fetch water for his mother and younger siblings. Trrowé paused, not for effect, but because you could hear a pin drop. No movement, no shifting chairs, no camera clicks on the way. He passes gold mines, shining hills of wealth, gold that leaves our soil and ends up in your jewelry stores, your smartphones, your private vaults. Gold. He'll never touch someone near the front. Wipe their eyes, Trump. Sat still expression unreadable. When Malik returns, he eats one small meal, sometimes none then, by candlelight. If there's wax left, he studies. He doesn't dream of Europe. He doesn't dream of escaping. He dreams of becoming an engineer, not to leave Africa, but to rebuild it, to dig wells, so no child has to walk 6 miles, like he does to build roads and hospitals, so his village can live with dignity. There was a long pause, and then Trrowé said, "That boy's dream is not a visa, it's not a plane ticket, it's justice, it's dignity." A collective breath passed through the audience. Some looked down, others looked at him and saw not just a president, but a man carrying the weight of every child. Like Malik, even the journalists, trained to detach from emotions, seemed to falter. One woman lowered her pen. Another wiped her glasses, but she wasn't cleaning them, and still Trrowé stood firm, not breaking, not blinking, his voice barely raised. Yet it filled the space more than any speech, before you ask why we're angry. But the truth is, we're not angry. We're awake. Malik doesn't need pity. He needs power. He needs opportunity. He needs a world that doesn't steal his future before he even has a chance to live it. That final line lingered not just in the air, but in the chest. It wasn't just about Malik. It was about millions. It was about every child the world forgets until they grow up with nothing left to give. And right there in a hall meant for handshakes and hollow promises, Trrowé handed back a truth no one could unhear. The story of Malik hadn't just touched hearts. It had shaken something deeper, but Traoré wasn't done. He had stirred the room with pain. Now he would confront it with truth. He turned to face the global leaders in front of him, not as a politician begging for aid, but as a man holding up a mirror. And what he said next made even the back row lean in. "You talk about corruption," he began. "You use the word as though it belongs to us, but it was built by you. Some shifted in their seats, others froze. It's not born in dusty villages. It's protected in your banks. It's written into your legal contracts. It's hidden in tax havens. You designed." A few advisors glanced nervously at one another, but Traoré continued. Voice calm, eyes unblinking. "Money stolen from Africa. Doesn't sit in Africa. It sits in your cities, under your lights, in your glass towers. Corruption doesn't begin in Kinshasa. It begins in Brussels, in Washington, in Dubai." The words didn't echo. They landed. "You point fingers at our leaders who take bribes, but who pays them Western oil companies, mining giants, arms dealers. You judge us for weakness, but you built the chains." Then he lifted his hand slightly as if pulling the curtain open, wider right now as I speak. "Children in Burkina Vaso are digging for gold, with bare hands. That gold will never pay for their schools. It will line the pockets of men in Geneva. A boy like Malik walks past those mines every morning, but his father died in one, buried alive in a collapse. No one reported working for a foreign firm that left the country without even an apology. His school has no roof, his dreams have no protection, and still we are told to be patient." He stopped briefly and looked across the room as if daring someone to deny it. "That boy doesn't need pity. He needs power. Not a charity drive, not a hashtag. He needs the world to stop stealing what was never theirs." Comment 1. If you believe Trrowé speaks the truth, the world keeps ignoring, you say. Africa has failed. But how can a tree grow if you keep cutting its roots? Every time we rise, you shift the rules. Every time we build, you change the game. Every time we dream, you buy the soil under our feet. A quiet gasp rose from somewhere in the middle. No one laughed. No one dared. Africa was never allowed to succeed. Trrowé said, his voice lower now, but heavier, as if carrying centuries behind every syllable, from colonial flags to IMF loans, from rigged contracts to stolen voices. "We were handed a broken system and blamed for the cracks." He paused, letting the silence settle. "We are demanding space to breathe, to create, to rise." His words weren't loud, but they echoed louder than any anthem sung at that summit. This wasn't just a speech anymore, it was a reckoning. The hall was no longer the same room. It had been an hour ago. Something irreversible had just happened, and then came the words that sealed it. "We are not asking for permission. Africa is ready to stand, and Ibrahim Trrowé, will stand first." It was quiet for a second, then a single clap, then two, then all at once the room erupted. Presidents from Latin America stood first, eyes bright with something more than respect. Ministers from Asia followed, hands raised in applause, even among the European delegation. A few rose slowly, as if realizing they had just witnessed not a speech, but a shift in history. Some clapped hesitantly, others with conviction, but the standing ovation swept the room like a wave. No one could stop. Cameras flashed. Journalists were scribbling furiously. Social media feeds lit up. before the summit had even ended within minutes. The hashtag #CharTroweeks. Truth was trending first in Nairobi, then Johannesburg, then Lagos by the hour's end. It had crossed oceans, appearing on phones in Sao Paulo, London, and New York, clips of Toro's speech, flooded timelines. One video showing the moment he said Africa was never allowed to succeed hit 1 million views before he even left the building. The impact was seismic in universities across Africa. Students gathered in dorm rooms and cafeterias to re-watch the moment. Some stood silently, others cheered in Ghana. A political science class stopped mid-lecture to project the speech onto a whiteboard in Nigeria. A rapper dropped a freestyle titled "Stand First," using Tro's closing line as the chorus in Kenya. A school teacher printed the entire transcript and handed it out as a reading assignment. This, she told her students, is what courage looks like in Senegal. A street artist painted a mural overnight. Trrowé standing tall, surrounded by children holding books and tools instead of guns. The words "not waiting rising" were scrolled across the sky, even beyond Africa. The reaction was staggering. International journalists rewrote headlines, Trrowé challenges, Trump and wins the world's respect from military jacket to global symbol, Burkina Vaso's leader, sparks a movement. Influencers, activists, and thinkers who had long been silent on African affairs were now quoting him, tagging his name, dissecting his speech. People who had never even heard of Burkina Vaso were Googling it. Curious to know more, the shock wasn't that Trrowé had spoken. It was that he had spoken so clearly, and the world had finally listened. And back home, the response was electric in Ouagadougou. Thousands poured into the streets. Some waved flags, others held up phones, playing the speech on repeat. Murals appeared overnight, T-shirts with Trrowé's face, and the words, "Hatch Tro, speaks truth," sold out in hours. Children reenacted moments of the speech at school, assemblies, local radio played audio clips between. Music elders spoke his name with pride. Youth carried it like fire. He didn't just speak for himself. One caller said on a live broadcast, he spoke for Malik, for my son, for all of us. And the movement didn't end with applause. A week later, Traoré announced a new initiative. Africa First. The goals were bold: direct keep, African resources in African hands, end exploitative contracts with foreign corporations, enforce real anti-corruption measures, even within his own administration, create scholarship programs, startup funds, and youth empowerment projects, investigate illegal offshore accounts, and bring stolen wealth back home. Suddenly, other nations took notice. Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, even oil-rich Nigeria sent delegations to Burkina Vaso. They weren't coming to offer help. They were coming to join. "We are not poor," a leader said at a regional summit. "We are rich nations with stolen futures. It's time we take them back." And at the center of it all was Trrowé, once dismissed as a populist, now called a visionary, and to many something more. He is the African lion. A young woman in Dakar tweeted, "Not because he roars, but because he protects across the continent." Artists, educators, workers, and children embraced that image. Trrowé wasn't perfect, but he was present. He had shown up in the room when no one expected him to speak, and spoke so no one could ever forget. And while Trump refused to comment further, the truth was, it no longer mattered. The spotlight had shifted. The center had moved. Africa was not asking to be saved. It was standing. It was building. And now it was being heard. But Trrowé didn't stop after the applause, the moment he left the summit. His next steps were already in motion. The speech in Geneva had made history. Yes, but when the cameras turned away and the headlines faded, he returned to the dust, the desks, the broken systems still standing in his country. And that's where real leadership began. The Africa First initiative moved from vision to action. Trrowé push through new mining laws that prioritized local ownership. He signed anti-corruption legislation that held even his closest allies accountable. He launched national youth programs, funding startups, training engineers, and expanding scholarships for those like Malik, who dreamed with nothing but candlelight. But the initiative wasn't just domestic. It sent shockwaves across the continent, from Ghana to Ethiopia, from Senegal to Nigeria. Governments began reviewing their own contracts. Leaders who once whispered their frustrations about foreign control were now speaking openly, quoting Traoré's words, and, more importantly, they were acting. What made it different? This time wasn't just policy, it was belief. The belief that Africa didn't have to imitate anyone, that it didn't need permission to reclaim what was always its own. But Traoré never claimed to be the answer. He was the start of a question, one the youth would have to finish. In speeches and interviews, he reminded everyone, "I can't fix Africa, no single leader can, but I can light the torch and hand it to you." And they took it. In cities, villages, classrooms, and markets, people stopped waiting. They created, they organized, they questioned, they built. The continent had not been cured overnight, but it had awakened. The world looked on, unsure whether to cheer or prepare, because something had shifted. Africa was not asking, she was moving, and this time she was not moving quietly. Not with noise, not with anger, but with clarity, with purpose, and with eyes wide open. Africa is not asking to be seen anymore. She is standing, and this time she will not step back. Subscribe to our channel to follow the real stories of Traoré and Africa's awakening every time he speaks. The world listens. See you in the next story.